Not because I didn't think Benedict Cumberbatch could play a compelling villain, I didn't know about him until this movie, but because I personally don't think Khan, Nooney, and Singh fits with this reality. I'm 99% certain that the only reason Abrams put Khan in the movie is so you could have a character yell Khan in a busted-ass role reversal of the iconic death scene from Wrath of Khan, and I'm sorry, it makes no fucking sense. This is especially fucked up now that I realize that Kirk was playing possum with his death scream in Wrath of Khan. And truth be told, the idea that Khan, Nooney, and Singh would exist in the Kelvin universe is so motherfucking stupid, I'm still not entirely sure why he's here, time paradox or not. Beyond that, Harrison's motives for taking revenge on Starfleet get extremely muddled by the third act. After he gets revenge on Admiral Robocop, aka Alexander Marcus, Harrison out of nowhere decides to pull a Frank Castle from Punisher Season 1 and goes completely off the rails by trying to AMF the Enterprise and her crew. You get the idea. It's a mess. I've heard some people argue that the only reason Carol Marcus is in the movie is so we can see her in her underwear. That might be the reason why Alice Eve is in the movie, but Carol Marcus is only in this movie because she was in Wrath of Khan, and this is a Wrath of Khan remake. The movie very loosely implies that she knows something about the torpedoes that Kirk doesn't, but that doesn't work because we already knew there was something sketchy about the torpedoes because Scotty refused to allow the torpedoes on board. It's the reason he resigned his commission. And given that we're 26 years away from the Genesis torpedo being a factor, not to mention the fact that this is pretty much an alternate reality in the first place instead of an altered timeline, it almost feels like Abrams forgot why Carol Marcus was in Star Trek II. Also, I have a question. Keeping in mind that this is an alternate reality and not an altered timeline, would someone care to explain to me how and why the hell Carol Marcus is British when her father isn't? I mean, there's having reverence for the material, and then there's being a fanatic about it, to the point where you miss out on details like that. And as I'm going to allude to, director J.J. Abrams seems to be more than a little confused about the difference. Number 5. Cats from 2019. No, that's it. What, you expected me to say more? This movie is ass. It should not exist. Period. Next question. Number 3. And number 4. Now, this may seem like I'm cheating here, but hear me out. Birth of the Dragon and Ghost in the Shell from 2017. It was hard for me to decide which of these is worse than the other because both of these movies suffer from the same problem, but for completely different reasons. Whitewashing. Now, this is admittedly one of those places where I have something of a bias, because believe it or not, Ghost in the Shell happens to be one of my favorite animes of all time. I'm particularly fond of the first 2 seasons of Ghost in the Shell standalone complex. I bring this up because there aren't enough words in the English dictionary to illustrate how much the live-action adaptation of Ghost in the Shell completely misses the mark. Put simply, it has neither the shell nor the ghost of Ghost in the Shell. And I found the live-action Ghost in the Shell movie completely boring as an action movie. Most of its action scenes, from what I remember, are either watered-down imitations of scenes from the animated movie or have too much noise around them for me to comprehend it, let alone be entertained by it. I should also address the elephant in the room. The Major is not a character. In both the movie and the animated series, Motoko Kusanagi wasn't the most fleshed out character, but there was an air of mystery to her. She was tough as nails, used her femininity to her advantage, and is practically a den mother to the rest of Section 9, while being Chief Automaki's right-hand woman. In a cosmic way, the best way I can summarize Major Motoko Kusanagi's character is that she's basically a combination of Rogue from X-Men Evolution, Melinda May from Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Ellen Ripley from Alien, and Felicia Hardy aka Black Cat from the Spider-Man comics. She's the exact opposite of whatever the hell this character is supposed to be. In fact, even calling her a character feels like it's cheating. And she may be a cyborg, but what Motoko Kusanagi isn't is RoboCop. Much has already been made of the controversy surrounding Scarlett Johannsen's casting as Major, so I'm just going to cut to the chase. Now, first of all, I like Scarlett Johannsen as much as the next cat, but when I think of a live-action portrayal of Major Motoko Kusanagi, let's just say my thoughts don't exactly leap to the Black Widow. And I realize that Mira Killian is supposed to be Japanese and doesn't actually look like Scarlett Johansson. This is just her shell. But that's not communicated very well, so it's easy for the situation to look like you just cast a Caucasian woman to play an Asian character and didn't stop to think about the implications of that. Altered Carbon, the Netflix series, has a completely different premise based on the story by Richard K. Morgan, and even that show has a better understanding of the ideas in Ghost in the Shell than the live-action Ghost in the Shell movie. Well, most of them. Yes, I'm talking about seasons 1 and 2. Don't at me. But beyond that, there's nothing interesting or memorable about Mira Killian. In addition to her being a discount Alex Murphy, Mira is portrayed as the black sheep of the police force. Her character arc, or what this movie passes off as a character arc, is undercut by the movie giving her a connection to the movie's villain, Kuze. A connection that incidentally didn't exist in Ghost in the Shell until season 2 of Standalone Complex, and even then it was very vague. I complain that Mira has nothing going for her, but at the end of the day, none of these characters have anything going for them. It's implied that Mira and not Bato have a romance, but the movie's pacing is so whack, it barely translates. Tokusa and Saito may as well be window dressing, and I'm not even going to bother asking why Aramaki is the only character in this film speaking Japanese, because A, I don't care enough about these characters or this world to unpack that, and B, I'm 99% certain that whatever explanation this movie has is just going to piss me off more. By contrast, Birth of the Dragon, the Bruce Lee biopic, has a different sort of whitewashing problem. It has an Asian lead, arguably two Asian leads, but they're both pushed to the side. Let me explain what I mean. Birth of the Dragon feels like it has three stories going on at the same time, and neither of them have anything to do with each other except for the fact that these characters are involved. One of these stories is actually interesting and centers around Wong Jack Man coming to San Francisco to atone for almost killing a student during a martial arts demonstration. The other centers around a rivalry between Wong Jack Man and this version of Bruce Lee, more on him in a moment, which is supposed to escalate in a showdown that ends in a draw. As you may have already guessed, much like the live-action Ghost in the Shell movie, Birth of the Dragon also suffers from a protagonist problem. Now, I've never met Bruce Lee. By the time I came into the world, he wasn't exactly around, so I can't really speak to Bruce Lee having an ego problem. But I know for a fact that it was nowhere near this exaggerated. Birth of the Dragon presents Lee as, well, not to put too fine a point on this, an arrogant dumbass. I mean, this guy is so damn full of himself, which is kind of a problem given that this is supposed to be based on a real person. I mean, this character has got to be one of the most arrogant ass motherfuckers I've ever had to watch, and I had to sit through an entire trilogy with these dipshits. Look, nothing personal against Philip N.G., Philip Nung, Philip Eng, Philip Nudge, screw it. Not Byung-Hung Lee certainly seems like he's trying, don't get me wrong, but this character seems like an extremely piss-poor representation of Bruce Lee. How is it that a live-action TV series based on the writings of Bruce Lee seems to have more respect for Bruce Lee's legacy than a Bruce Lee biopic does? Beyond that, both Lee and Wong Jack Man's stories get lost in the scramble when the movie decides to focus on its third story, which sees the Caucasian male named Steve developing a romance with a nameless Asian woman he's known for less than 5 seconds. And Steve's an even bigger asshole than Lee, or at least this movie's version of Lee. First off, Steve is a kung fu student of Lee's who starts hanging out with / training with Wong Jack Man because he thinks Wong Jack Man is cooler than Lee. And I don't know how long Steve's been training under this movie's version of Lee, but that seems like a bit of an asshole thing to do. The second asshole thing that Steve does is try to instigate a rivalry / competition between Sifu Lee and Wong Jack Man in regards to who's the better fighter. But I'm not entirely sure why, because it seems like these two people would have eventually crossed paths in the first place anyways. He even politely tells Steve, "I came here to silence my pride, not to indulge it." And later on, in the third act, when Lee asks Wong Jack Man, "Why are we at war?" referring to the two of them, Wong responds with, "We're not at war." From what I remember, the choreography for all the fights, particularly the fight between Lee and Wong Jack Man, is pretty good. But a lot of the reasons for why this fight happens make no damn sense whatsoever. It doesn't help that Wong Jack Man ends up being right. Lee, or at least this version of Lee, is undisciplined and has no principles. "You're the past, I'm the future, and you know it. Motherfucker, are you trying to get smacked upside your head?" Speaking of the third act, Steve and this random nameless Asian woman have known each other for less than a day. They don't have any chemistry. As far as I can tell, since it's been a while since I've seen it, she barely speaks any English in that movie, and Steve doesn't see her as anything more than an object to be saved. So even though this is supposed to be a biopic, whatever romance you might interpret between Steve and the random nameless Asian woman is already null and void. And then he has to f*** around and get the woman kidnapped, which causes Lee and Wong Jack Man to come to the woman's rescue. And incidentally, this is the only time in the movie where Lee and Wong are on the same page. What makes this incredibly awkward, though, is that aside from Lee and Wong Jack Man, nearly every single character in the film, including Steve, is made up. Lee and Wong Jack Man are the only two characters in the film who are based on real people. So why is Steve even here? I mean, American Gangster is entertaining in certain places, and even I know that parts of Frank Lucas's history are fictionalized. Same thing goes for Richie Roberts. But I don't necessarily mind that as much because I'm entertained by what I'm watching. Meanwhile, what's Birth of the Dragon's excuse for going so far out of left field? Either way, both of these movies feel like a disservice, and I have a feeling that if I saw either of these movies in theaters, I'd be asking for a refund. Number 2. The entire Star Wars sequel trilogy. Yeah, I know it's a cop-out to put all three of these movies in the same spot, and I don't give a damn. This has to be said. Star Wars The Force Awakens promised a lot, and it did not deliver. Now, I don't hate The Force Awakens as much as everybody else does, but I'm also not a very huge fan of it myself. Even though I've only seen 1/3 of this trilogy, if you've seen The Force Awakens, you've pretty much seen the entire sequel trilogy. In summary, The Force Awakens has the exact same problem Independence Day Resurgence had a year later, and ironically, the same problem the later sequels would have down the line. It wasn't planned very well, and it took too damn long to come out. Even the parts of the sequel trilogy that aren't strictly incompetent have an unsettling cloud hanging over them because J.J. Abrams, Rian Johnson, and Kathleen Kennedy couldn't decide what kind of story they were trying to tell with the OG trio, assuming they were trying to tell a story at all. Unfortunately for Kathleen Kennedy and company, I exist. If Disney Lucasfilm wanted to tell a Star Wars story that takes place post Return of the Jedi, then 13 years seems a little bit shy of the mark. Now, even though the story was over, it used to be fun, once upon a time, if you can remember, to imagine what Han Solo, Luke Skywalker, and Leia Organa would do with their lives and the galaxy as a whole after the events of Return of the Jedi, now that they no longer have to contend with Emperor Palpatine, and now that Darth Vader is off the board. And this is just based on my estimation from the movies, knowing very little about the expanded universe. The real expanded universe, not the new stuff. Like, maybe Luke and Leia would start working together to train a new generation of Jedi who are at peace with their feelings, probably with some guidance from the Force ghosts of Anakin Skywalker, Obi-Wan, Yoda, and Qui-Gon to balance the new Jedi. Or maybe Leia arranges for Han Solo to be a member of the New Republic. Maybe Chewie finally gets promoted to a 5-star general. Maybe C-3PO finally gets an upgrade. The possibilities seem endless. But nowadays, it's a different story. Anyway, back to the sequel trilogy. The last time I reviewed Star Wars The Force Awakens was about 4.5 years ago, and at the end of that review I made a statement that I'm now about to rephrase. In a reckless attempt on my part to leave the review on a positive note, I said that The Force Awakens feels like Star Wars. In retrospect, what I should have said was that The Force Awakens wants to feel like Star Wars, or at the very least, it wants you, the viewer, to feel like it's Star Wars, and it can't do it. Poor bastard. The same, unfortunately, cannot be said for Star Wars The Last Jedi, a movie so far removed from feeling like Star Wars, much less wanting to feel like Star Wars. I'd almost hazard a guess that it's a shame to be called Star Wars. Let's get the obvious out of the way right now. In my review of The Force Awakens, I said I didn't care for the idea that Rey was secretly Luke's daughter, because I had a hard time believing that Luke, a guy who grew up on a desert-ass planet, would abandon his own daughter on another desert-ass planet, thus making him a deadbeat parent, even if he was trying to keep her safe. Plus, if he wasn't willing to abandon his own friends, no fucking way is he going to do that to his own daughter. And guess what? I still stand by that. Having said that, what Ruination Johnson decided to do with Luke Skywalker is about on the same level of stupidity as making Luke a deadbeat dad, and one could certainly argue that it's worse than that. In The Last Jedi, we're expected to believe that Luke, a man who came dangerously close to killing Vader, but chose not to, is willing to execute his own nephew Ben Solo in his sleep, all because of a premonition he had of Ben killing everyone he knows. And we're also asked to believe that that's the catalyst for him abandoning his own sister and his closest friends so he could go to the First Jedi Temple to die, even though that's clearly not what J.J. Abrams had in mind when he worked on The Force Awakens, when the entire point of the third act of Return of the Jedi was that Luke wasn't willing to go to the dark side like his father did, and we're asked to believe that he'd execute his own nephew, and that his shame for even trying to do so made him suicidal.